This 1877 portrait of a blacksmith and boy looks ordinary until you notice the iron ring. It seemed like hundreds of other occupational portraits from the period. A white craftsman in his leather apron, tools arranged carefully behind him, a young black child standing at his side. The kind of image that shows up in local history books captioned "Southern Industry After the War" or "Skilled Trades in the New South." Until one detail made it impossible to look away. Margaret Chen had worked as a collection specialist at a regional history museum in coastal Georgia for 11 years. She had processed more than 8,000 photographs in that time, most of them unremarkable, all of them requiring the same careful attention. The portrait came to her in the spring of 2019, part of a donation from the estate of a family that had owned property in the area since before the Civil War. The donor, a great-granddaughter living in Philadelphia, had sent 3 boxes of papers, a few pieces of furniture, and a single framed photograph wrapped in brown paper. The note attached said only, "From the Mathers family, believed to be 1870s. Please find it a good home." Margaret unwrapped the photograph in the museum's climate-controlled processing room. The albumin print was in remarkable condition, the sepia tones still rich, the details sharp. She noted the studio backdrop, a painted forest scene popular in that decade. She noted the blacksmith's carefully combed hair and trimmed beard, his hand resting on an anvil. She noted the boy, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, standing slightly behind and to the left, wearing clothes that were clean but clearly handed down, several sizes too large. His right hand hung at his side, his left hand was positioned behind his back, mostly hidden by the blacksmith's body. And then she noticed the ring. It was small, barely visible at the edge of the frame, a dark curve of iron just below the boy's hidden wrist. At first she thought it was a shadow or damage to the print. She adjusted her magnifying lamp and leaned closer. The ring was attached to something, a short length of chain that disappeared behind the blacksmith's coat. She could see now that she was looking how the boy's posture was slightly twisted, his shoulder pulled back at an angle that would be uncomfortable to hold. He was not standing freely. He was tethered. Margaret set down her magnifying glass and sat back in her chair. She had seen difficult images before, images of chain gangs in convict labor camps, images of lynchings preserved as postcards, images of enslaved people photographed as property inventories. But those images announced their violence. They did not pretend to be something else. This photograph had been framed and displayed in someone's parlor. It had been passed down through generations as a family keepsake. And the whole time, hidden in plain sight, was a child in chains. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written, "J.D. Mathers, blacksmith, with Silas, taken at Harmon's studio, Savannah, 1877. Margaret had been in this work long enough to know that curiosity was not neutral. Every archive held stories that someone had decided not to tell. Every gap in the record was a choice, made by people with reasons to keep certain things quiet. If she set this photograph aside, filed it with a neutral description, moved on to the next box, the story of the boy called Silas would stay buried for another 100 years. And something about the way his eyes looked directly at the camera, steady and unblinking, made her feel that he had been waiting long enough. She opened her laptop and began to search. The first leads came quickly. Harmon's studio had operated in Savannah from 1869 to 1884, run by a photographer named Edwin Harmon, who specialized in occupational portraits and family groups. His advertisements in the Savannah Morning News promised likenesses of the highest quality, suitable for parlor display. Margaret found a handful of other Harmon portraits in online collections, all of them conventional, all of them posed with the same painted backdrop. None of them showed anything unusual. J.D. Mathers was harder to trace. The 1870 census listed a James Decatur Mathers, age 34, occupation blacksmith, living in Effingham County just north of Savannah. His household included a wife named Clara, 3 children under 10, and in a separate entry at the bottom of the page, a domestic servant named Silas, age 6, listed as mulatto. The column that should have noted Silas's relationship to the head of household was left blank. Margaret pulled up the 1880 census next. The Mathers family had moved to a larger property. James was now listed as a forge master with 2 employees. Clara was still present, along with 5 children, the oldest now 14. But Silas was gone. There was no one named Silas in the household, no servant, no apprentice, no additional family member. He had simply vanished from the record. She reached out to Dr. William Osei, a historian at a university in Atlanta who specialized in post-emancipation labor systems in the Deep South. She had consulted him before on other projects, and she trusted his judgment. She sent him scans of the photograph and the census records and asked if he could help her understand what she was looking at. His reply came 2 days later, and it was longer than she expected. "What you're seeing," he wrote, "is almost certainly a case of apprenticeship under Georgia's post-war labor codes. After emancipation, Southern states passed a series of laws designed to keep black workers, especially children, bound to white employers. In Georgia, the 1866 apprenticeship law allowed courts to bind orphans and children of freedmen to white masters until they reached adulthood. The law required that the master provide food, clothing, and training in a trade. In practice, it was slavery by another name." Dr. Osei explained that these apprenticeships were often arranged without the consent of the child's family. In some cases, children were simply taken. In others, their parents were pressured or tricked into signing contracts they could not read. The courts, staffed by white judges, almost always ruled in favor of the white employer. And because the apprenticed children were legally bound to their masters, they could be physically restrained if they tried to leave. "The iron ring you're describing," he wrote, "was a common tool. Not a full shackle, just a simple cuff attached to a short chain. It allowed the child to work but prevented them from running. Masters would sometimes attach the chain to a belt or a fixed point in the shop. The practice was widespread enough that freedmen's aid societies documented dozens of cases in the 1860s and 1870s. But the photographs that survive almost never show the restraints. That's what makes your image so unusual. Either the photographer failed to hide it, or the blacksmith wanted it visible as a kind of warning." Margaret read the email 3 times. Then she went back to the photograph and looked at it again. The boy's face, she realized, was not blank. It was careful. He was looking at the camera the way you might look at someone who could hurt you if you made the wrong move. And the blacksmith's hand, resting so casually on the anvil, was positioned exactly where it could reach the chain if the boy tried to step away. She needed to know more about Silas. Not the Silas in the census record, a name and an age and a racial category. The real person. The child who had stood in that studio and looked into that lens and left behind a single image that no one had read correctly for 140 years. Margaret drove to Effingham County on a Saturday in late May. The old Mathers property was now a subdivision, the original buildings long gone, but the county courthouse still held records dating back to the 1820s. She spent the morning in the archives, working through ledgers and deed books and court filings, looking for any mention of Silas or the Mathers family. What she found was a system. James Mathers had acquired Silas through a court order dated April 12, 1866, less than a year after the end of the war. The order described Silas as a colored orphan, approximately 5 years of age, found wandering without visible means of support. It bound him to Mathers as an apprentice until his 21st birthday, a term of 16 years. The order was signed by a county judge named Horace Pemberton, and it listed no family members, no next of kin, no one who had been consulted about the arrangement. But Silas was not an orphan. Margaret found his mother in a separate set of records, the freedmen's labor contracts that had been filed with the local Freedmen's Bureau office in 1865 and 1866. Her name was Delia, and she had been enslaved on a plantation 12 miles north of the Mathers property. After emancipation, she had signed a 1-year labor contract with her former owner, agreeing to work for wages and a share of the crop. The contract listed her household as including 1 child, male, age 4, Silas. The contracts filed the following year, 1866, showed Delia signing again with the same employer, but this time the household entry read, "No children." Margaret cross-referenced the dates. Delia's second contract was signed on April 18, 1866. The court order binding Silas to James Mathers was dated April 12, 6 days earlier. Someone had taken the child first and then waited for the paperwork to be filed. By the time Delia signed her new contract, her son was already gone. Dr. Osei had warned her that this was how the system worked. The apprenticeship laws were written to look like charity, like a way of providing for homeless children, but they functioned as a labor supply pipeline. White employers would identify the children they wanted, file a petition claiming the child was an orphan or vagrant, and the courts would rubber stamp the transfer. Black parents had almost no legal recourse. The Freedmen's Bureau tried to intervene in some cases, but the Bureau's authority was limited, and its agents were spread thin. By 1868, when federal oversight began to weaken, the courts were processing these orders with almost no scrutiny at all. Margaret found 3 more apprenticeship orders in the Effingham County records, all of them signed by Judge Pemberton, all of them transferring black children to white employers. One of the children was listed as the property of the late R. Harwell, a phrasing that made clear the judge did not consider emancipation to have fully taken effect. Another order noted that the child's mother had objected to the arrangement, but that her objection was overruled because she was unable to provide suitable care. The standard of suitable care was not defined. It did not need to be. The outcome was predetermined. She drove back to Savannah with a box of photocopies in her passenger seat. Somewhere in the landscape she was passing, Silas had grown up in a blacksmith shop, chained to a workbench, legally bound to a man who had taken him from his mother by court order. He had been photographed, displayed, handed down as a family heirloom. And then, between 1877 and 1880, he had disappeared. Margaret spent the next month trying to find him. She searched death records, marriage records, prison records, military records. She searched church membership rolls and cemetery indexes and the scattered surviving records of black mutual aid societies. She contacted genealogists who specialized in African American family history and asked if they had ever encountered the name Silas in Effingham County. No one had. Dr. Osei suggested that Silas might have run away. Many apprentice children did, especially as they got older and stronger and realized that the system holding them was not really legal anymore. The 13th Amendment had been ratified in 1865. The apprenticeship laws were supposed to be about training and care, not about ownership. But the distinction meant little to a child in chains. If Silas had escaped, he might have changed his name, moved to another state, built a life somewhere that no record connected to his past, or he might have died. The mortality rate for apprentice children was high, especially those bound to heavy trades like blacksmithing. Accidents were common. Medical care was rare, and if a child died while in service, the master was not required to notify anyone. He could simply bury the body and move on. Margaret kept looking. She found Delia in the 1870 census, still living in Effingham County, still working as a domestic laborer. Her household now included a daughter, age 3, listed as born free. There was no mention of Silas. Either Delia did not know where he was, or the census taker did not ask. And then, in a collection of Freedmen's Bureau records that had been digitized only a few years earlier, Margaret found a letter. It was dated September 1867 and addressed to the Bureau's Savannah office. The handwriting was shaky but legible, the spelling inconsistent, the tone desperate. It was signed, Delia Freedwoman Effingham. Sir, the letter began, I write to ask for help in finding my son Silas, who was taken from me by court order in April of last year. I was told he is apprenticed to a blacksmith named Mathers, but when I went to ask after him, I was turned away and told I had no right to see him. I am his mother, and I have been free for 2 years now, and I do not understand how the court can say I cannot care for my own child. I have work and a place to live, and I can provide for him. Please, I'm asking you to look into this matter and tell me if there is any law that can help me get my son back. There was a note clipped to the letter, written in a different hand. It was from a bureau agent named Thomas Whitfield. It read, Referred to county court, no action taken, file closed. Margaret sat in the archive reading room and looked at the letter for a long time. She thought about Delia walking to the Mathers property, asking to see her son, being turned away. She thought about Delia dictating this letter to someone who could write, paying whatever small fee was charged for the service, waiting weeks or months for a response that never came. She thought about the bureau agent reading the letter, scribbling a note, putting it in a folder, moving on to the next case. The whole system had been designed to make people like Delia disappear, to make their claims seem unreasonable, their grief seem excessive, their children seem like charity cases who should be grateful for whatever they received. And the photograph, the carefully posed photograph in the Savannah studio, had been part of that design. It showed a respectable white tradesman, a productive member of society, generously teaching his craft to a young colored boy. It did not show a kidnapping. It did not show a mother's letters going unanswered. It did not show the iron ring. Or rather, it did show the ring, but no one had been meant to look that closely. No one had been meant to ask what it was attached to. Margaret brought her findings to the museum's director, a man named Richard Foley, who had held the position for almost 20 years. She laid out the photograph, the census records, the court orders, the letter from Delia. She explained what she believed the image really showed. Not a benevolent apprenticeship, but a form of post-emancipation child labor that operated through legal coercion and physical restraint. She recommended that the museum not only accept the photograph into its collection, but build an interpretive display around it, one that told the full story of Silas and Delia and the apprenticeship system that had separated them. Foley listened carefully. He asked questions about the sources, about the chain of evidence, about how certain she was that the iron ring was really a restraint and not some other kind of tool or ornament. Margaret answered as precisely as she could. She had consulted with Dr. Osei, who had confirmed that the object in the photograph was consistent with the restraints described in bureau records. She had found no alternative explanation that fit the evidence. The photograph showed what it showed. Foley was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The Mathers family has been significant donors to this museum." Margaret had not known that. The name had not registered when she first processed the donation. "Helen Mathers Preston," Foley continued, "the woman who sent us the photograph, her family has contributed to our endowment for 3 generations. She's also on the board of a foundation that funds our education programs. If we display this photograph with the interpretation you're describing, we're essentially accusing her ancestors of kidnapping a child and keeping him in chains." "We're describing what the historical record shows," Margaret said. "I understand that, but you know how these things work. People don't see historical context. They see their family names next to words like restraint and forced labor, and then they stop writing checks." The conversation went on for another hour. Foley was not hostile to Margaret's research. He even said several times that he believed her findings were accurate and important, but he was also clear that he could not approve a public display without consulting the board, and he was not optimistic about what the board would decide. Several members had personal connections to old Georgia families. Several others were primarily concerned with the museum's financial stability. A controversy over a single photograph, Foley suggested, might not be worth the institutional cost. Margaret left the meeting with the understanding that her recommendation would be reviewed and that she should not discuss her findings publicly until the board had made a decision. She waited 3 weeks. Then she sent her research to Dr. Osei and asked if he knew any journalists who covered historical justice stories. The article appeared in a national magazine 6 weeks later. It was titled, "The Boy in the Iron Ring: How a Georgia Museum Photograph Exposed a Hidden System of Child Bondage." The writer had interviewed Margaret, Dr. Osei, 2 other historians, and a genealogist who specialized in tracing the descendants of enslaved people. The article included a high-resolution scan of the photograph, with the iron ring circled and enlarged. It included excerpts from Delia's letter. It included a statement from Helen Mathers Preston, who said she had been deeply disturbed to learn the history behind the photograph and supported the museum's decision to display it with full context. That decision, it turned out, had been made very quickly once the article was in press. Foley called Margaret the day before publication to tell her that the board had approved an interpretive display and that she would lead the team developing it. He did not mention their earlier conversation. He did not apologize. He simply said that the museum was committed to telling difficult histories and that her research had been invaluable. The display opened 4 months later. It occupied a small gallery on the museum's 2nd floor, designed around the photograph as a central object. Visitors encountered the image first in its original presentation, framed and respectable, the way it had appeared in the Mathers family parlor. Then a panel invited them to look closer, to notice the detail at the edge of the frame. A magnified image showed the ring and the chain clearly, and the wall text told the story of Silas and Delia, of the apprenticeship laws that had separated them, of the letter that had gone unanswered. Dr. Osei spoke at the opening. He described the photograph as a document of organized theft, a visual record of how white Southerners had used legal systems to maintain control over black labor, even after slavery had been formally abolished. He named the apprenticeship laws as one of the first steps in a long process of racial exploitation that continued through convict leasing, debt peonage, sharecropping, and segregation. The photograph, he said, showed not an exception but a pattern. In the audience was a woman named Patricia Gaines, who had driven from Florida to attend the opening. She had seen the magazine article and contacted the museum because she believed Silas might be her ancestor. Her family had oral histories going back generations, stories passed down from her great-great-grandmother about a son who had been stolen by the court and never seen again. The great-great-grandmother's name had been Delia. Margaret met with Patricia after the event. She showed her the documents, the letter, the timeline. She could not prove a direct connection, but the names and dates and locations matched. Patricia looked at the photograph of Silas for a long time, touching the glass gently, as if she could feel him looking back. "He was so young," she said. "He was just a baby." The museum added Patricia's family history to the display, a panel describing the oral tradition that had kept Silas's memory alive when the written record had tried to erase him. It quoted Patricia directly. "My family never forgot him. We didn't know his whole story, but we knew he had been taken. We knew it was wrong. And now the world knows too." That single photograph, 3 inches by 4 inches, had been sitting in a parlor and then an attic and then a storage unit for 140 years. It had been seen by dozens of people, maybe hundreds, and none of them had looked closely enough to notice what was hidden at the edge of the frame. Or maybe they had noticed and decided not to say anything. Maybe they had understood exactly what the iron ring meant and chosen to keep it a family secret, a private inheritance, something that did not need to be explained to outsiders. What makes an image like this so dangerous is not what it shows, but what it almost hides. The photographer had been careful. The blacksmith had been careful. They had arranged the scene to look like something acceptable, even admirable. A tradesman and his young helper, a white man giving a black child an opportunity. The story the photograph told was the story they wanted people to believe. And for over a century, that story had worked. But the photograph also recorded what they could not fully conceal: the angle of the boy's shoulder, the tension in his posture, the small, dark curve of iron at the edge of the frame. Silas could not speak in that moment. He could not refuse to be photographed, could not demand that the chain be removed, could not tell the camera who he really was and what had been done to him. But his body told the truth anyway. And eventually, someone looked closely enough to see it. There are thousands of photographs like this one, stored in archives and attics and museum basements across the country. They show happy families and prosperous farmers and respectable businessmen. They show well-dressed children standing beside well-dressed adults. They show order and stability and progress. And hidden in the corners, in the backgrounds, in the objects clutched or concealed, they show something else. Hands positioned in ways that suggest restraint. Feet bare on cold floors, expressions that do not match the occasion. People whose names were never recorded, whose stories were never told, whose presence in the frame was meant to be decorative or incidental. Every one of those photographs is evidence. Every one of them is waiting for someone to look closely enough. And somewhere in the records, if you know how to search, there is almost always a letter. A mother asking where her child has gone, a father demanding an explanation, a family refusing to accept that what was done to them was legal or justified or right. The system worked hard to silence those voices. The courts filed their objections and marked them no action taken. The employers turned them away at the door. The historians focused on other stories, easier stories, stories that did not require this kind of attention. But the voices are still there, preserved in the same archives that preserve the documents of their dispossession, waiting, like Silas waited, for someone to finally look.